U.S. President Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine this past weekend to reiterate his support for their war effort with both military and moral support. Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his State of the Nation address Tuesday, suspended its participation in key arms treaty with the U.S. Ian Garner is a student of Russia and author, most recently, of Stalingrad Lives, Stories of Combat and Survival. He joins us now from Kingston, Ontario, on the language of this geopolitical moment. Welcome back to the program, Ian.
Hi.
All right, so yesterday was a day of two major speeches, Putin's and Biden's. Let's start with Putin's speech. Of course, a very long one. I believe it was nearly 2 hours. I think it was an hour and just about 40 minutes. Almost a year since the invasion of Ukraine. What did you make of Putin's overall tone?
Well, I thought that the headline message was that Russia is now a wartime state and that Putin is trying to prepare the apparatchiks who were in the audience, there were several hundred of them, senior figures, and prepare the public for a war that might go on for a long, long time. So he made all sorts of promises about education, about compensation for veterans, but also challenged the West and told the public that Russia is almost not really at war in Ukraine. It's in a much bigger conflict, a conflict of civilizations, a conflict that might go on for a long time.
Was there any acknowledgement on his part of things not going as intended originally?
Well, perhaps surprisingly, not really. There were some quiet nods to compensation for people who were struggling. There was a couple of moments of empathy for the scale of the sacrifice that people at the front and behind the lines at home were making. But I would say that those moments were very much lost in this long and quite rambling diatribe about history and this much broader conflict, and of course lost in the news about the nuclear treaty.
Of course, in that rambling, and not surprisingly, Putin condemns the West in his speech. Can you break that down a little bit? He who decided to attack Ukraine claims to be a victim of Western aggression.
So this is something that Russia has been arguing for quite some time. It's not new. The idea is that somehow the West has taken over Ukraine, is using Ukraine as a jumping off point to attack Russia, and that if Russia didn't supposedly strike first in 2022, then it would have been attacked itself. And we saw that message after Putin's speech reiterated by several leading propagandists and on state media.
In terms of perception, and I think the assumption is that this speech was for fellow Russian citizens, how persuasive do you think his speech was for them?
I think in and of itself, the speech was quite unwatchable. Putin is not a great orator. He gives very stilted, tedious deliveries. He speaks slowly. He's not a sort of firebrand speaker that gets people riled up. What this speech does, though, is gives themes to propagandists, themes to state media that they then take and spin out into much more appealing content. So Russians may not be watching this speech, certainly in its entirety, but even chunks of it, but they'll be seeing the materials from it, this idea of a conflict with the West, the idea that Russia is under attack, the idea that we had to do it somehow, then dripped across their social media feeds and across television and newspapers for at least the next few weeks.
I think one of the bigger takeaways from Putin and Russia is that Putin said that Russia will suspend the New START nuclear arms treaty. I'm curious, what does this signal, not only to the West, but the rest of the world, that this is what he's going to do? And what does that actually mean?
I mean, in practical terms, in a sense, it means very little, because Russia has shown itself over the last few years to be an untrustworthy player when it comes to international agreements. So I don't think there'll be any surprise or panic on the part of the USA or NATO about what's happening. Of course, it's regrettable. It's not the desired outcome. But this sort of move will have been factored into their decision-making already. But I think at a tactical level, on a strategic level, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, We've been hearing a lot of talk in the media over the last couple of months about war fatigue. Should Ukraine sue for peace? At what point will Ukraine and Russia be ready to negotiate with each other? But Putin is saying, I won't negotiate with anyone. I'm not ready to make deals because the West can't be trusted.
I'm curious, do you sense that the threat of using nuclear weapons is working in Putin's favor in being able to intimidate Westerners?
I mean, of course, we always have to take this seriously. And this is why Putin has been able to fight this war in Ukraine, which on the battlefield he is struggling with deeply and seriously, and yet continue to provoke, continue to push at the boundaries of what's permissible, and of course go beyond the boundaries of what's permissible legally and morally. However, what is Putin's red line when it comes to nuclear weapons? There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of thrusting and posturing and posing, and yet we haven't seen that the state has really shown any willingness to confront the West in a serious way. Indeed, look back to, you may remember the incident a few months ago when supposedly a Russian missile had landed in Poland, which could have been a big red line. Russia was very quick to play down what had happened there and say this wasn't us. We don't want to go to war with the West over this. And so we have this sort of abstract idea of war with the West, the civilizational clash that Putin talks about in the speech, but he doesn't really want that war because it would mean the end of Putin and probably the end of Russia as soon as nuclear weapons come into the picture.
All right, let's switch gears. Let's talk U.S. President Joe Biden. To the surprise of many, Joe Biden showed up in Ukraine's capital of Kiev last Monday for a 6-hour visit. What difference did this trip make for Ukrainians?
Well, the Ukrainian reaction was just hugely positive. Ukraine is perpetually worried, and possibly for good reason, that at some point that war fatigue will set in, that the West will start to drift away from Ukraine, that America might start pushing Ukraine to make large territorial concessions in order just to wrap this war up for the moment at least. But by appearing in Kiev, while the war is going on in an area that has been under fire, and indeed there was an air raid warning while Biden was in Kiev, Biden is showing very clearly that we've got your back. We're not going anywhere. And he reiterated that point in a speech in Warsaw yesterday.
Well, let's talk about that, of course. A day later, Joe Biden stood in the middle of Warsaw and delivered his own speech. What was your impression in comparison, just as overall quality of speech?
I think the speech was stronger. It was clear that the momentum is with the West. The momentum is with Biden. That Biden is able to choose his path. Putin seems to be kind of backed into a corner. He almost has no choice but to keep going in the war, because admitting defeat at this point would be hugely embarrassing for him on a personal level. Biden, on the other hand, has the choice. Do I choose to support Ukraine? Does America choose to push in a different direction? Well, he's very clearly almost rubbing Putin's nose in it. I can go to Central Europe. I can go to Kiev. You are stuck in the Kremlin talking to these rooms of graying bureaucrats and military figures.
Now, at the end of the day, for U.S. President Joe Biden, sustaining public support for Ukraine among various Western countries is essential. Was the speech of the kind that bolstered public support for Ukraine overall?
I think so. I think certainly in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, it's very clear to the publics and the politicians there where the sympathies of America lie. But the one warning I would have with that is there remains an underlying uncertainty about what will happen in 2024, given the American presidential election.
In terms of your take, what's your sense on how Biden's speech was received by Russians?
Well, they were furious, especially about the visit to Kiev. Almost as soon as he landed, there was an outpouring of rage, of frustration, because the image of Joe Biden in Russia is of sleepy Joe Biden, a man who's aging, who is powerless, who is emasculated, who can't get anything done. And in contrast to Putin, who is meant to be, in the propaganda world at least, this kind of all-action, horse riding, judo fighting kind of macho guy. Well, Putin was the man who was supposed to be in Kiev as the victor almost a year ago. And yet here Joe Biden is striding tall, walking around, looking at ease. And so some of the reaction was not just rage against America, but also frustration with Putin. Frustration that supposedly the full might of the Russian war machine hasn't been unleashed yet, and that actually Russia needs to push even harder in the war.
With that being said, is there any chance that Russians are beginning to see Biden as a leader who will not be intimidated by Putin?
I think there is a frustration, less with Biden personally and more with the lack of disunity in the West. When you read the Russian media and when you see what trends on Russian social media, almost any story about even a minor politician from Europe who comes out in favor of Russia or maybe opposes sanctions, a European Union policy. We hear lots about Republicans on the far right who are opposing aid packages for Ukraine. These things blow up in Russia, even if actually they have very little significance politically in the West.
Final question to you, Ian. Looking at both these speeches, both coming at sort of the time of the anniversary, the 1 year of the invasion here, do we have a better sense of what a victory looks like for Russia?
The one thing that Putin perhaps surprisingly didn't talk about in his speech yesterday, didn't even allude to, is what are the terms for the end of the conflict in Ukraine? What does it mean to win a special military operation versus a war? And what will Russia be happy with? And so I think Russians at some point may begin to be frustrated as the quality of life slowly deteriorates, as the promise of a sort of utopian united Russia future where Ukraine is subjugated once more to the imperial center in Moscow, none of that is coming true. At what point do Russians stop? At what point do Russians get frustrated? And we might start to see it. However, there is no guarantee that the answer will be that Russians want peace, want an end to the war. They may, as I briefly alluded to a few minutes ago, want to see an even more aggressive war that will somehow wrap things up and will result in an even more destructive series of behaviors on the front.
Russia would come in there and overwhelm them with their troops, and that simply has not been the case, thanks largely to the resolve of Ukrainian forces and their people, but also support from the U.S. and the West, supplying them with weapons and also additional aid to keep them propped up during this fight. There's been concern now about what Russia's President Putin will do next, as he is now backed into a corner militarily and also economically. So we heard the president tell ABC's David Muir just yesterday that he does not believe that Russia will start to lean on nuclear weapons. This comes after Putin announced that he intends to temporarily withdraw Russia from the New START treaty, the last nuclear agreement between the U.S. and Russia. He believes that despite that pullout, a pause, if you will, that there are no plans to escalate this to a nuclear conflict. But there is concern about possibly Moscow reaching out to Beijing for what they're calling lethal military aid. As of right now, there are no signs that's happened, but a major thing that the White House is watching, as well as NATO, because if that were to come to pass, this could really change the tenor of this conflict.
If you could speak more into the war efforts in Ukraine, they don't appear to be coming to a close anytime soon. And as you mentioned, the U.S. has shown their support for the country and their war efforts, and they intend to continue to do that for the long run for Ukraine.
That's right. We heard the president say in Ukraine that he intends for the U.S. to stick by Ukraine for as long as it takes. As of right now, the end is not very clear. We have not heard a very firm assessment of what the end of this war will look like. We've heard the leader of Ukraine, President Zelensky, say that he believes it will be when Russia fully leaves Ukraine, including Crimea, which was illegally annexed some 8 years ago now. So that is what the end looks like. We are not close to that as of right now. Russia very much digging in its heels in this conflict, bracing Ukraine is now for perhaps a spring offensive. There have been aerial attacks, missile attacks in Ukraine now for several months overhead in the morning and the evening. As of right now, 13 million Ukrainians have been displaced internally and externally. So even if this comes to some kind of end soon, the rebuilding will take, no doubt, decades at least.
We know that neither side is really going to back down from the fight at hand, as you mentioned, but especially with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has temporarily suspended Russia's participation in the latest remaining nuclear arms treaty between them and the U.S., where do things kind of go from here from a Russian standpoint?
From a Russian standpoint, we know they will comply with parts of that treaty, which will be a cap on nuclear weapons that would be respected by both sides. That will remain for now. But when that treaty expires, very likely Russia will not seek to renew it, which sets the stage for even more of a Cold War-esque conflict between the U.S. and Russia. What happens from this point on, Russia and President Putin have really worked to draw a line between the West and those who support Russia. Many were saying the speech that he gave this week, that State of the Nation, was indeed an address to those countries who are sympathetic to their plight, others who believe that NATO and the West are growing too powerful in that sphere. So as we move forward in this year observance of this conflict, it really appears now more than ever that we're at an inflection point, as the president said, into the direction of not only democracy, but the balance of power in the globe. If China does indeed follow through and supply Moscow with weapons, that would greatly change the scope of this war. We have heard China say over and over again that the major weapon supplier in this conflict is not them, it will never be them, but it is the U.S. And they are accusing the U.S. of hyping up Ukraine and perhaps next hyping up Taiwan. So you see what they're building towards as well.
And aside from the fighting, we've also seen the outpouring of support from people across the globe to help the people of Ukraine after many had fled the country once the first shots were fired. What more can you say about the efforts from people to help the refugees, whether it's temporarily help them for some close to Ukraine, or even here in the United States with people finding homes for these refugees?
We know millions of Ukrainians are now around the world displaced because of this conflict. Again, the UN counting at least 13 million. Many are in Poland, some here in the U.S., and others in other countries as well. That will take a very long time to recover from. However, there is a commitment to helping Ukraine that is coming from the G7. They are pledging now to raise $39 billion this year to support Ukraine's not only their fight, but also to support their people. So that's a great deal of money being set aside just this year alone. And it does, again, give you a sense of how much they are committed to supporting Ukraine through this fight. As we have heard the president say, and many others, this is building up to be a fundamental fight in their eyes for the future of democracy. And that if Ukraine falls in this case, it could begin a domino effect of autocracy across